The roses arrived at the wrong door on the coldest morning of the season, and the woman who opened it had not been sent flowers in 7 years. Eliza Marwood stood at the threshold of the small back room above the dressmaker's premises on Bennett Street, her fingers still chapped from the cold water of the wash basin, and looked at the footman in livery she did not recognize holding a great cradled armful of hothouse roses, the color of clotted cream. He read from a card. He said a name that was not hers, a lady's name, a name that belonged 3 doors down and 1 floor up, to the rented rooms where the season's bright young women lodged, when their families could afford the address, but not the house. He said the Duke of Ashworth begged the lady would accept these with his compliments. Then he looked at Eliza properly, at the apron, at the pins held between her lips, at the plain gray stuff of her gown, and his certainty faltered. She did not take the flowers. She told him, around the pins, that he wanted the front rooms, that he wanted Miss Catherine Vane, that he had come up the servants' stair by mistake. She watched him flush and gather the roses closer and back away, with the particular embarrassment of a man who has handed something precious to someone the world has decided does not deserve precious things. The door closed. The smell of the roses stayed behind in the cold air of the landing, sweet and entirely out of place, and Eliza stood a moment longer than she meant to, breathing it, before she went back to the hem she had been turning since before dawn. To the house on Bennett Street, she was the seamstress in the attic, the widow with debts, the woman who had come down in the world so far that no one troubled to ask how far up she had begun. What none of them knew, what she had told no one, in 7 years, was the thing she carried folded against her like a second heart, and you will want to stay for the moment it is finally seen. She had been Eliza Hartley once, which is to say she had been a gentleman's daughter, with a pianoforte and a governess, and the expectation of a season of her own. That was before her father's death uncovered the debts he had hidden behind his good coat and his easy laugh, before the cousin who inherited turned her out with a fortnight's notice and a sermon on economy, before the brief marriage to a kind and ailing man named Marwood, who left her his name, a great deal of fondness, and £300 of obligations she was still paying, down a shilling at a time. Now she sewed for Madame Lefebvre, who was neither French nor a madame, but knew the value of the pretense, and who took half of what Eliza earned for the privilege of the attic room and the use of the workroom fire. She was 24 years old. She had taught herself not to want things, because wanting was a door that only opened inward, onto a room she could not afford to furnish. The Duke of Ashworth had taken the largest house on the square for the season, and the whole street knew it within a day. Edmund Ashworth was a man people described in weather. His face was still as ice over a deep river, his manner cold enough that the matrons who longed to secure him for their daughters spoke of him in the same breath as a difficult climb, a thing worth the discomfort for the view at the summit. He had buried a young wife 3 years before. That much the gossip carried freely. What the gossip did not carry, because no one living had been given it, was the shape of the silence he had kept, since the way he moved through rooms as though something in him had been set down somewhere, and never retrieved. He sent roses to Miss Catherine Vane because his aunt had instructed him to begin somewhere, and Miss Vane was the somewhere his aunt had chosen. That aunt was the Dowager Duchess of Ashworth, and she had come to town for the express purpose of seeing her nephew married before the year turned. She was a woman of considerable dignity, and considerable diamonds, and she held her fan always a half-inch higher than the conversation required, as though to remind the room of the distance between its concerns and her own. She had selected Miss Vane the way one selects a horse for line and temperament in the absence of anything irregular in the breeding. She did not yet know that the roses had gone astray, when she learned of it 3 days later, and from a maid who could not keep her face composed, she went very still, and then she laughed a small laugh that did not reach her eyes, and she said that no harm was done, that a duke's flowers in the hands of a seamstress were like pearls in the keeping of a magpie, admired and not understood. The maid repeated it below stairs. It traveled. By evening, half the street had heard that the dowager had called the widow in the attic a magpie, and the street, which loved a tidy cruelty, kept the word. Eliza heard it from the girl who fetched the milk, who meant no unkindness, and delivered it the way children deliver. Knives point first, and without knowing. A magpie. Eliza thanked her, and turned back to the seam, and did not let her hand falter on the needle, because she had learned long ago that the only dignity left to her was the dignity of not flinching where it could be seen. That night, when the workroom fire had sunk to coals, and the house had gone quiet, she took the folded thing from beneath the loose board under her cot, and she opened it by the light of a single candle. It was a letter, and a small portrait the size of her palm, and these were the only proof remaining in the world of who she had been and what she had loved. She did not weep over them. She had passed beyond weeping years before. She simply held them until the candle guttered, and then she put them away, and slept, and rose before dawn to sew. The Duke came to Bennet Street himself, a week later, and that was how it began in earnest. He came to call upon Miss Vane correctly this time, by the front stair, and Miss Vane received him in the rented drawing-room with her mother arranged beside her, like a second piece of furniture. The visit was everything it should have been and nothing more. Miss Vane played a sonata without error and without feeling. The Duke sat with his perfect stillness and his perfectly civil answers, and watched the clock with the part of his attention that was not required for civility, and thought that his aunt was right, that this would do, that a man might marry such a woman and trouble her very little, and be troubled very little in return, which was as much as he now asked of any arrangement. He took his leave at the correct hour, and on the landing descending, he heard through a half-open door the sound of a voice he did not know, reading aloud. It was a low voice and unhurried, and it was reading Cowper to someone, the lines about the stricken deer that left the herd, and the someone was coughing, a thin wet cough that belonged to a sick child or a sick old woman. The Duke stopped on the stair. He had no business stopping. The voice read on, gentling the harder lines, skipping nothing, and when the coughing worsened it paused, and he heard the small domestic sounds of a cup lifted, of a pillow turned, of a person being tended by someone who expected nothing for the tending. He stood longer than a man of his rank ought to stand on a back stair. Then he went down and out to his carriage, and he did not mention to anyone what he had heard. And he could not have said himself why the sound of an unknown woman reading poetry to an invalid had reached into him and moved something that 3 years of careful arrangement had kept from moving at all. The sick woman was Madame Lefebvre's mother, ancient and failing, and Eliza read to her in the evenings because no one else would, and because the old woman's eyes had gone and the dark frightened her. It cost Eliza an hour of sleep she could not spare. She did it anyway. This was the quality the Duke had heard without seeing, the thing the house on Bennet Street had decided not to notice, the small, costly daily kindness that asked for no witness and received none. He did not know her name. He knew only that there was a voice in that house that read Cowper to the dying, and that the world had told him such a voice belonged to a magpie, and that the world, in this one particular, had begun to feel to him like a thing he could no longer entirely trust. He found reasons to return. A man of his rank does not need reasons. Which made the reasons he invented, all the more telling to everyone but himself. He called on Miss Vane with a regularity that delighted the Dowager and the Vanes, and bored him to the edge of his composure, and each time he came he listened on the stair, and twice more he heard the voice, and once he saw her. She was crossing the lower passage with the basket of mending, her gray gown, plain as ash, among the painted panels, her dark hair pinned without ornament, and she did not see him in the shadow of the stairhead. He saw her. He saw the way she carried the heavy basket without complaint, the way she stepped aside for a maid. With an instinctive courtesy, the maid did not return, the way her face, in repose, held a stillness that matched his own, and had clearly been bought at a similar price. He stood very still. Something in his chest did a thing it had not done in 3 years, a small sharp turning, and he mistrusted it immediately and could not make it stop. The dowager, who missed very little, did not miss the way her nephew's eyes had begun to travel toward the back of houses. She did not know the cause, and she did not like the symptom. She increased the tempo of her campaign. She arranged a dinner, and then a card party, and then an evening of music at which Miss Vane might shine, and she spoke to the Duke with greater frequency of settlements, and St. George's, and the advantage of a spring wedding. And because she was a woman who liked to know the ground she stood on, she made inquiries into the household on Bennet Street, into every soul who lodged or labored there, and in time the inquiries brought her the seamstress in the attic, the widow Marwood, the magpie, and a curious detail her informant could not account for, which was that the woman had been gently born and had fallen, and that no one knew quite how far she had fallen from. It was at the dowager's evening of music that the label was spoken aloud for the second time, and in public, and to Eliza's face. Madame Lefebvre had been engaged to attend with a girl to manage the ladies' wraps and torn flounces, and Eliza was that girl standing in the anteroom in her gray gown with a work-basket, invisible by design. The dowager swept through with Miss Vane on her arm and paused, and looked at Eliza with the particular pleasure of a woman who has found a use for someone, and said loudly enough for the three ladies behind her to hear that here was the very magpie of Bennet Street. And was it not a wonder how some birds would dress themselves in any borrowed feather and call it plumage? The ladies laughed. Miss Vane laughed a pretty practiced laugh. Eliza inclined her head, and said nothing, and her hands were perfectly steady on the work-basket, and only she knew the cost of that steadiness. Across the room, near the terrace doors, the Duke of Ashworth set down his glass untouched and turned, and his face did not change, but he had heard the word, and he had seen who it was aimed at, and the small, sharp turning in his chest became something colder and more certain. He crossed the room. He did not cross it to her, which would have ruined her, and he was not a man who ruined people carelessly. He crossed it to his aunt, and he said, in a voice pitched only for her, that he wished to be introduced to the woman she had just insulted. The dowager's fan rose a half-inch. She told him there was nothing there to introduce, only a seamstress, a widow with debts. He looked at her with the stillness that had unnerved better women than Miss Vane, and he said that he had asked for an introduction, not an inventory. And the dowager, who had not been spoken to in such a tone since her husband died, found for the first time in many years that she did not entirely command the room. She gave him the introduction. She made it a small humiliation, naming Eliza as Madame Lefebvre's girl, as though she had no name of her own. And Eliza curtsied and said, "Your Grace," in a voice that was low and unhurried, and the Duke knew the voice before she finished the two words. It was the voice from the stair. He stood looking at the woman who read Cowper to the dying, dressed in gray among the borrowed feathers, and he understood that the world had been lying to him for a month, and he said quietly that he believed he had heard her read. Eliza's composure did not break, but a faint color came into her face at the cool wrist where her glove ended, a warmth she could not command, and she answered that she read sometimes to Madame Lefebvre's mother, who was unwell. The Duke asked what she read. She told him. "Cowper," she said, and sometimes Cowper again, because the old woman liked the one about the deer and asked for it most nights. And the Duke of Ashworth, who had not smiled in company since his wife was buried, did not smile now either, but something moved behind his eyes, and he said that it was a good poem to be read aloud, and that he hoped the old woman valued her reader. Then he bowed, correctly, and returned to the company, and left Eliza standing with a heart that had begun, against every instruction she had given it, to beat in her throat. I should tell you, before the season turns colder, that the moment you are waiting for is coming, and that it will be worth the wait. Stay close. The roses, you will remember, went to the wrong room first. What the Duke could not have explained, and what the midpoint of any honest account requires, was the precise shape of the thing her steadiness had reached. 3 years before, his wife had died of a fever in the country while he was in town on business. He had judged more pressing than her low spirits, and he had come home too late, and had found that she had spent her last clear evening reading to no one, alone, because the household had not thought a duchess in low spirits required company. He had never forgiven the house. He had never forgiven himself. He had folded the grief into a flat, hard square, and carried it where it could not be seen, and he had resolved to feel as little as a man could decently feel, and to marry, when he married, a woman to whom he would never owe more than courtesy, so that he might never again arrive too late to a heart that had needed him. He kept her portrait turned to the wall in his study. He had not been able to look at it, and he had not been able to put it away. And the sound of a stranger reading aloud to a dying old woman asking nothing, simply because the dark frightened her, had walked straight through 3 years of careful arrangement, and laid its hand on the exact place he had hidden. He began to find his way to the back of the house. It was improper, and he knew it, and he did it with the deliberate care of a man who has decided that one impropriety, conducted honorably, is worth more than a lifetime of correct emptiness. He came one afternoon when Miss Vane was indisposed and found Eliza in the workroom, alone mending by the window in the last of the light, and he did not announce himself but stood in the doorway, and when she looked up and rose in alarm, he said only, "Sit down." She did not sit. He said it again, lower. "Sit down. You have been on your feet since dawn. I can see it in how you stand." And the protection inside the order reached her, even as the order itself confused her, and she sat slowly. And he came and stood by the cold hearth at a proper distance, and asked her, as though it were the most natural thing in the world, what she was reading now that the old woman slept through the afternoons. They spoke of books. It was the only safe country between them, and they both knew it, and they walked in it carefully. He found that she had read more than he had, and read better, and that she made no display of it, and that when she forgot herself she spoke of Cowper and of Mrs. Radcliffe and of a translation of Dante her father had owned, with a warmth that lit her plain face into something the candlelight could not account for. He found that he did not want to leave. He stayed past the light, and when at last he took up his hat, he paused at the door and told her in the level voice that gave nothing away that she should not let the house make her smaller than she was, and Eliza, who had been made smaller every day for 7 years and had never once heard a soul object to it, found that she could not answer him at all. The dowager learned of the visits. A house has many eyes, and most of them are for sale, and the price of Eliza's small safety had never been high. The dowager did not make a scene because a scene would have acknowledged a rival, and she would sooner have acknowledged a draft. Instead, she moved with the cold efficiency of a woman protecting an order she believed in absolutely. She went to Madame Lefebvre. She observed that a respectable establishment could not wish to harbor a woman who entertained gentlemen privately, that such things ruined a dressmaker's custom, that the widow Marwood had perhaps grown above her station, and would be better placed elsewhere, in the country, far from temptation, and the Duke. And Madame Lefebvre, who feared the dowager's word more than she valued Eliza's hands, gave Eliza a week's notice, and the name of a position as a maid of all work in a house in Yorkshire, 300 miles from Bennet Street, and from any man who might send roses to the wrong door. Eliza took the notice the way she had taken every blow of 7 years. Without flinching where it could be seen, she thanked Madame Lefebvre. She began that night to pack the little she owned into the single trunk that had followed her down all the stairs of her descent, and the dowager, not yet content, arranged the last turn of the screw. She let it be known, at the next gathering, in the hearing of every matron who mattered, that the Duke had been the object of a seamstress's scheming, that the widow Marwood had thrown herself in his way, that the whole sorry business had been managed by a fortune-hunter in grey, who knew precisely what she was about. It was the third voicing of the label, dressed now in its Sunday clothes, and it was spoken not to Eliza's face but behind her back, where she could not answer it, in the witnessed third-party report, that does the most lasting harm. By morning the Duke had heard that the woman he had begun to love had been named a schemer in every drawing-room on the square, and that she was leaving for Yorkshire within the week, and that his aunt had arranged both. He went to the workroom one last time before the dark moment closed over them entirely. He found Eliza folding the gray gown into the trunk, and the candle lit and the fire dead, and her face composed and her hands steady, and he asked her if it was true that she was leaving. She said it was. He asked if she wished to leave, and here Eliza, who had deflected and suppressed and gone quietly smaller for 7 years, found the one honest sentence she could not have said a month before, and she lifted her eyes to his and said that it did not signify what she wished, that women like her were not asked what they wished, that she had learned to want nothing precisely so that she might never again stand at a door and watch something precious carried away to a room that was not hers. The Duke understood that she was speaking of the roses. He understood a great deal in that moment. He was a man who had arrived too late once before, though, and the old fear closed his throat. So he said only that he was sorry. And he left her to her packing, and Eliza sat down on the floor beside the half-packed trunk, and did not weep because she had passed beyond weeping, and that was somehow worse. She did not go to Yorkshire. That much she decided for herself. Sitting on the floor in the dark, she would not be moved 300 miles like a parcel to spare a dowager's peace. She had a little money saved against exactly such a day, and she had her 2 great proofs of who she had been, the letter and the small portrait, and she resolved to take rooms of her own, however mean, and to seek her own situation, and to belong to no household that could dispose of her at a duchess's word. It was not a triumphant resolution. It was made in the cold, on a hard floor, by a woman with nothing. Yet it was hers, and it was made from her own values, and not from anyone's permission, and when she rose from the floor she was, in some small unwitnessed way, no longer the magpie of Bennett Street. She was a woman who had decided. What she did not know, what no one had told her, was that the small portrait she carried against her heart was the proof of more than sentiment. She unfolded it that night to draw what comfort it held, and she looked at the painted face for the 1000th time, the face of her father as a young man, and she looked at the letter folded beneath it, which was not from her father at all but to him, and which she had read so many times she no longer truly read it. This time by the guttering candle, with her whole life pulled up by the roots, she read it again as though for the first time, and she saw what grief had let her overlook for 7 years. The letter named a settlement. It named a sum held in trust, a small independent fortune settled on her dead mother, and her mother's heirs separate from her father's ruined estate, untouched by his debts, and forgotten by everyone because it had been made in another county, under another name, and the cousin who inherited had never known to look for it. She was not penniless, she had never been penniless. She had been too buried in surviving to read her own deliverance, folded all this time against her heart. The Duke, meanwhile, had gone home to his study, and the portrait turned to the wall, and he had stood before it a long while, and at last he had turned it around. He looked at his dead wife's painted face, and he begged her pardon, not for loving again, but for the 3 years he had spent making himself small enough to deserve no one, when she, of all people, would have wanted him to be large enough to deserve someone. Where? He thought of Eliza on the back stair reading Cowper to the dark. He thought of his aunt's word magpie and of the borrowed feathers, and he understood at last that the only borrowed feathers in the whole sorry business were his own, the cold and the distance and the careful emptiness, all of it borrowed from his grief and worn so long he had taken it for his skin. He rang for his carriage, at an hour no Duke calls. He went to his aunt first, because a man should clear his own house before he enters another's, and he told the Dowager Duchess of Ashworth that he intended to marry, and that the woman he intended to marry was the woman she had driven toward Yorkshire, and that she might attend the wedding, or she might return to the country, but that she would not say the word magpie again in his hearing, or in anyone's. The Dowager went white. She told him he would ruin himself. He told her he had been ruined for 3 years, and was only now repairing the damage. The reversal came, as these things must, In the same arena where the verdict had been passed, the dowager, cornered and proud, played her last card, and it was a public one. She let it be known that the Duke would announce his choice at the season's great ball at Ashworth House, and she let it be known so that all the world would gather to watch a Duke humiliate himself over a seamstress, certain that the weight of every eye would bring him to his senses, where her own arguments had failed. She arranged Miss Vane in ice blue at her right hand. She arranged the candles in the orchestra and the terrace doors, thrown open to the cold, bright night. She arranged everything but the ending. And she had Eliza brought, because the cruelest part of her plan required the magpie, present to be dismissed in front of the world, summoned under pretense of mending a torn flounce, delivered to the edge of the ballroom in her gray gown, to witness the Duke choose correctly. At last, Eliza came because she did not yet know she was free, the letter's full meaning still settling in her, and because some part of her needed to see the door close with her own eyes. She stood at the edge of the bright room among the servants, the only plain thing in a sea of silk, and she watched the Duke of Ashworth at the head of the room, and she waited for the verdict. The dowager rose. She had prepared her ground. She spoke of her nephew's coming announcement, of the honor to a certain family, and her eyes went to Miss Vane, and the room followed her eyes, and Miss Vane lowered her lashes in pretty expectation. And then the Duke crossed the room. He crossed it in 3 strides, past Miss Vane, past his aunt, past every diamond in the place, and the orchestra faltered and stopped, and the whole bright room turned to follow the only man who was moving. He crossed it to the edge, where the servants stood, to the woman in gray, and he stopped before her. And the silence that fell was the silence of 200 people who have all at once understood that they have come to see something other than what they were promised. He looked at Eliza, and Eliza looked back at him, and the warmth rose at her wrist and the beat returned to her throat, and she did not lower her eyes. The Duke took her hand. He did not lower his voice, because the whole point was that the whole room should hear. He said, "I will marry Eliza." Hartley or no one, the silence held. It held for a long moment in which nothing in the world moved but the candle flames in the draught from the open terrace doors. The dowager's fan, which had ridden a half-inch high for 40 years, descended. Her hand, when it reached for the back of a chair, did not find it at once. Miss Vane's practiced expression came apart by degrees, the way ice gives, without sound, all at once. And the room, the cruel, tidy room that had named a woman a magpie and laughed, began to do the thing the dowager had been most certain it would never do. It began to recognize. An old gentleman near the front who had known Eliza's father said her true name aloud in wonder. Hartley! Surely not Hartley's girl. And the name ran back through the company like water finding its level, and the borrowed feathers fell from her one by one, in the eyes of every person there. Until what stood at the edge of the room was not a seamstress at all, but a gentleman's daughter, gravely born, who had been seen at last by the one man whose seeing could reorder the world. Into that silence came the procedural seal as it must, for a duchess does not undo a duke with a single bad evening. The Duke's own solicitor, present among the guests, stepped forward at a glance from his master, and confirmed quietly to the nearest peers what the Duke had already known an hour, that inquiry set in motion that very week had uncovered a settlement, held in trust for the late Mrs. Barr. Hartley's heirs, a small independent fortune, lawful and untouched, that made the woman in gray an heiress in her own modest right, and no fortune hunter at all. It was the same deliverance Eliza had read by her own guttering candle, confirmed now in the one register the world could not argue with. The dowager heard it. She was a proud woman and a cruel one, and confidently wrong. But she was not a stupid one, and she understood that the ground had shifted under 40 years of certainty. And she sat down in the chair she had at last located, and said nothing because there was nothing left in her whole polished armory to say. The Duke did not gloat. He had crossed the room and claimed a name, and that was the whole of what the moment required. and a man of real feeling does not gild a thing already finished. He drew Eliza's hand through his arm, in the sight of all of them, and he walked her the length of the bright room at the pace of a man with nowhere he would rather be, and at the terrace doors he paused, and he asked her, lo, only for her, whether she would forgive a man who had once arrived too late and was determined never to do so again. And Eliza, who had taught herself for 7 years to want nothing, found that the door that only opened inward had swung at last outward, onto a room she might furnish after all, and she said yes, and the single word undid every hard square she had folded herself into. They were married in the spring, quietly, at the small church near Ashworth's country seat, rather than at St. George's before the world, because neither of them had anything left to prove to the world, and a great deal still to say to each other. The dowager attended. She had been given the choice her nephew promised her, the country or the wedding, and to her credit, which was greater than her cruelty had suggested, she chose the wedding. And she stood at the back in gray, the color she had once mocked, and watched her nephew marry the woman she had tried to send 300 miles away. And something in her hard face, loosened by a fraction that no one but Eliza, who forgave easily because she had been forgiven nothing, troubled to notice. Miss Vane married a baronet within the year and was, by all accounts, content, having wanted a position rather than a man, and having got one. The first snow of their first winter together fell on a window Eliza had come to think of as hers. She stood at it in the early dark of the new house that was now her home, the great quiet house she had once only sewn for, and below her in the warm room the fire was lit and the candles were lit, and an ancient woman dozed in the best chair by the hearth. For the Duke had sent his own carriage to fetch Madame Lefebvre's blind mother from Bennet Street, and install her where the dark would never frighten her unattended again, because his wife had asked it, and because he had learned that a household is measured by whom it troubles to tend. Eliza had her book open in her lap. She had been reading Cowper aloud, the lines about the deer, and she had paused only to watch the snow. On the small table beside her lay the letter and the portrait, no longer hidden beneath any loose board, set out at last in the open where they belonged, the proof of who she had been, now resting easily in the house of who she had become. The Duke came and stood behind her chair and looked out at the falling snow with her, his hand resting on her shoulder, and neither of them spoke, because the season of needing to speak had passed. The old woman stirred and asked in her thin voice, "For the deer, for the part about the stricken deer that left the herd," and Eliza smiled and turned back to the page and found her place. The fire settled. The snow came down without sound, upon the window she had claimed, and in the warm and candlelit room, the woman the world had once decided not to see read aloud to the dark, and this time the dark was full of people who loved her, and not one of them was sent to the wrong room ever again. Thank you for staying to the end of Eliza's story. If A Quiet Woman Finally Seen is the kind of tale that warms you, leave a word below telling me the moment that stayed with you, and the next one will find you when it is ready.